Think tanks are becoming useful instruments in shaping government policies across the world. They do not only conduct research, but create space for debate, generate ideas, monitor policies, and provide intellectual resources to the public. However, in Africa, think tanks still face major challenges which hampers their potential to spearhead development efforts on the continent. On the occasion of the Central African Think Tank Forum to hold in Yaoundé, we are using the opportunity to delve into the pivotal role of think tanks and how this event could potentially boost the efficiency in the Central African sub-region. Stay with us. A surgeon by training, my guest has always been involved in philanthropic activities and issues related to international development. He is currently the president of the Association of Cameroonian Physicians in America. He is also the co-founder and pioneer president of the Cameroon Professional Society. He remains very involved in helping young Cameroonians transition into professional institutions and advance in their professional careers. He has been recognized with multiple academic and professional awards such as the Vanderbilt Dean Scholarship, the Overall Fellowship, and the Community Service Awards from CAMSA. He holds a bachelor's degree with honors in biological sciences from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, a Doctor of Medicine degree from Vanderbilt University School of Medicine, Nashville, Tennessee. He completed his surgical residency training at Emory University School of Medicine in Atlanta, where he was also the Global Health Research Scholar. A holder of a master's degree in public health from Bloomberg School of Public Health at the Johns Hopkins University, and another in business administration from the Carey School of Business, also in the same institution. He is also the co-founder of the Denis and Loretta Foretia Foundation. Join me to welcome the founder and chief executive officer of the Nkafu Policy Institute, Dr. Denis Foretia. Dr. Foretia, thank you very much for joining us once again.
Thank you, Mr. Associate. It's a great honor for me to join you.
We are talking about think tanks because the Nkafu Policy Institute will spearhead the Central African Think Tank Forum to hold in Yaoundé. Let's begin with this complex issue around the definition of think tanks. Why is it so complex to define what a think tank is?
Well, thank you very much, Peter. I think the reason why we have this difficulty in defining think tanks is because there is a plethora of institutions or groups of individuals who have as mission to influence policy. But influence policy in what way? Influence policy with good policy analysis. Policy analysis that's done in an unbiased fashion. And so there is a big distinction between what are independent think tanks or versus think tanks that are affiliated to political parties or affiliated to a different political ideology. But what we currently understand as think tanks are institutions that undertake independent policy research to analyze a policy question in the country and then propose really evidence-based solutions for government to implement. And usually, the anchor of these policy recommendations has to be the betterment of society as a whole, not the betterment of an individual or a political party. And so that's where some of the distinction comes into play as to whether you are an independent research institution or whether you are an institution that's affiliated to a political party, or you provide contract research to policymakers, or you're part of a university institution such as research institutions that are part of universities. So there is this plethora of different organizations that function in providing policy advice to government and different policymakers. And so that's where some of the confusion comes from.
All right. Now, we'll come back to that, but I would like to ask, think tanks used to be seen as a European thing. When did Africa embrace it?
Well, I think I would pretty much say, rather than a European thing, you know, over the last couple of decades, there's been a big view of think tanks as a very American issue. Clearly, there are European experiences in think tanks. There are many European institutions that provide independent research and have been doing that for decades and even centuries. But the current notion of think tanks is, you know, really comes from the American space, where there is over in the 1960s and 70s or so, certain independent research institutions in the US became very popular in influencing the policy process across the US. One of the characteristics of these institutions have been their independence. That means they're not affiliated to a particular political party. And undertake research that, you know, looks at a particular issue and delves down into it to figure out how it affects the society as a whole. So that is very key. But I would disagree that think tanks are not African in nature. In the pre-colonial era, in some of the research that we are doing on Nkafu and some of the work that we've done in looking at pre-colonial trade, you would be surprised, my friend, to know that there are, when we talk about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement today, in pre-colonial Cameroon, trade was free.
Yes.
It was free.
Yeah, that's
so
true.
It's not something that is not African. It's something that was African, and then the colonial era happened. And during the colonial era, a lot of our traditional institutions and decision-making processes were all put aside. And then European administrative processes were put into place. And those European administrative processes are processes that we were not used to. And so it took a while. But you would agree with me that in our traditional institutions, when chiefs and kings needed to make important policy decisions that affected society, they conducted...
They start with the notables.
Notables, and most notables were not affiliated in the formal hierarchy of the governing institutions in a particular community.
Yes.
They were notables based on their accomplishments and their know-how, their knowledge, but not necessarily that they were part of, you know, the formal hierarchy in a fondom or in a chiefdom or things like that. But they were recognized for how they provided independent assessment, evaluation of the issues to allow the decision makers at the time to make those decisions. So think tanks are not necessarily European in nature. Even in the Peruvian societies, back in 1700, there were many institutions in Peru, in Latin America, that were, you know, providing independent, you know, research to decision makers at the time. So, unfortunately or fortunately, the current notion of think tanks has been popularized by the American and European system, and so there are times when we think that they all originate from there. Yeah. But in Cameroon, in the pre-colonial era, that happened. That was part and parcel of us. And obviously, things evolved, you know, during colonial era, after colonialism, and in the neo-colonial era that it is, you know, there's been an evolution of it, and we can talk about that, but there's been that evolution as well.
Of course, let's just delve into that. Talking about the evolution, what has been the difference between African think tanks in the yesteryears and the current contemporary ones?
Well, so the important thing to understand is that when we think of our policy making, let me break it down in a simple way. Now, we know that, for example, when you think about health insurance, let me use health insurance. The Cameroon government, for example, in 2015 adopted a policy to ensure universal health coverage. Now, Mr. Nsosi, how do we go about ensuring that that policy that was adopted becomes active? How do we do it? How much do we expect an individual Cameroonian to contribute? And how much do we expect an individual Cameroonian who does not have a formal employment to contribute? how much do we expect a Cameroonian who makes 200,000 francs a month to contribute versus a Cameroonian who works in a farm in Bakingili or somewhere and doesn't have formal income? How do we go about that? So that's a policy question. And the role of institutes like Nkafu also is to figure out how to make that happen and propose the right solution for the country. But I'll tell you that when you look at the colonial era, when we got independence, and many other African countries, when we became independent, we had this honeymoon period where some of the African intellectuals, Cameroon not excluded from it, were very engaged with policymakers at the time. They had studied abroad or studied in different African institutions, and they were all together in making policy. The policymakers would ask the intellectuals what they thought, so to speak. But then, you know that historically in the 60s, a lot of our African countries, went into dictatorships. Yes. And very soon, policymakers were no longer interested in evidence-based research. It was a military council that ruled, and in that military council, there was no debate. So there was one way, and the way was the way of the president.
Of the president.
So all other ideas pretty much were lost. Then the 90s came, and there was multi-party, that came into place, and the space was created a little bit now for policy ideas, to come in. But then it quickly became, you are either for one party or you are for the other. And there was this dichotomy where intellectual discourse was separated along the lines of your political affiliation or your tribal group or things like that, which pretty much prevents a country from, from tackling the major crisis that it faces in a way that ensures long-term economic development. And that is what has happened since the 90s. And across Africa, you see there is now a resurgence in coup d'etats, right? A resurgence in coup d'etats. And you ask the question, why do you have issues like that resurging? And what solutions do you need to put into place to make that happen? Those are the questions that you cannot have military councils or closed space answer. And because you can have closed spaces to answer those questions, in order for your society to really advance, you have to open up the knowledge economy. You have to open up the knowledge economy. You can make a policy, like we hear all the time, that we want our economy to be a digital economy. But, Mr. Socia, if we look at our budget, the amount of money that our government has invested or set aside on the budget for science, technology, engineering, and math does not jibe with the stated policy
with the
ambition, right? So there is the key role of think tanks and independent research institutions to kind of like say, if this is where we want to go, if the policy trajectory or the vision is established, how do we get there? And what are the policy choices that we as a country or as a continent need to make to be able to get there? And that's where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, because there are real good ideas, really good policy options on the table. But unfortunately, most of the time, our governments, do not really, take it into consideration. There are times when you talk with a politician and you say, well, you know that the world is round. And they'll look at you and say, Dr. Foretia, where I see the world is flat. You can't do that. Like, you have to be able to use evidence to make sure that the policy that you implement directly affects the lives of millions of your citizens in a positive way. That is the key.
Okay, now, what makes a good think tank?
That's a great question. Now, I think fundamentally, what makes a good think tank, it's a think tank that, is not, I don't want to say corrupted, but that goes for, looks at the evidence of a particular issue and proposes that, evidence, that policy, irrespective of the political repercussions. Right? Irrespective of the political repercussions. So I'll give you another example. Do you know, Mr. Socia, that in our country, Cameroon, you can go to the hospital and have treatment done or give birth, women who give birth, but then you will not leave the hospital. Not because you die, but because after you've given birth, you can't pay the bills.
The bills, and you're detained somehow.
Detained. You're detained. Mm-hmm. That is something that we have studied to figure out, hospital detention. We just recently published on that. Hospital detention as practices. You can have hospital detention as a credible practice, a credible policy option. You can have women go and give birth, and because they can't afford to pay the bills, you detain them. But those are practices that happen, across our hospitals, right? How do we go about changing that? First, you got to research on it. You got to make it known to the public. You got to go to the policymakers and say, in the hospital administration, this cannot work. But at the national level, there has to be a way. Other countries have done it. There has to be a way for us to figure out how to cover folks who cannot afford. And the way a country treats the least, endowed amongst its citizens is pretty much indicative of the social fabric of that society. So it's very important for us to, when we tackle policy issues like that, so a good think tank has to look at a real issue, a key issue that's affecting the society, and figure out what are the range of policy options that are there, and uses a very methodical approach to assess the policy options. Now, there may be options that we want to undertake, which is the best option, but the financial situation does not allow for that, which may lead a think tank to propose a stepward approach. We do this first, then we do this, then we do the next thing for it. But a really good think tank has to be very independent in its analysis and be willing to actually put that analysis on the table to you, the media, to the government, practitioners, to say these are the options that we need to take, and of all these options, this is the best. The problem we see is that a lot of policy making is done in a black box, at times with development partners, and very little involvement of, Cameroonians themselves. And that's part of the reason why you have think tanks like ours, to ensure that policy issues that affect Cameroonians are really debated, proposed by Cameroonians themselves. That's fundamentally important. We can't relegate policy making to foreigners. Our own policy making, things that directly affect us, has to be put on the forefront by Cameroonians themselves, because they are way too educated. They know where it hurts, and they know solutions to get out of there. And so those are the issues that we are looking to do, and I would say those are things that really define good think tanks.
Doctor, you mentioned earlier that governments are somehow reluctant, governments in Africa are somehow reluctant to listen to the proposals from think tanks. What explains this little friction between the government and think tanks?
Well, I think, part of the fundamental issues that you face is that, unfortunately, many folks in our governments, we have a view that we are not humble enough. Let me be frank. We are not humble enough. But I'll tell you that it's a book I read a couple of days ago, Good to Great, by Jim Collins. Good to Great. How good institutions become great institutions, right? How good institutions become great institutions. How a good business, a good enterprise transitions to become an excellent enterprise. And there are key issues that are there. The first thing is that, in that organization, there is what is called level 5 leadership. Level 5 leadership. Level 4 leadership is somebody who is very competent, who knows what to do, right? But there's a brashness to that individual. Level 5 leadership is somebody who knows what needs to be done, is extremely competent in the technical aspects of management and leading. But with that technical understanding of the issues is extremely humble. Extremely humble. I said this many times. I have never met a Nobel laureate who was proud. If you find one Nobel laureate who is proud, let me know.
No,
but
Nobel
laureates, even though you win the Nobel Prize in chemistry, in medicine, in literature or so, when you meet them, they are extremely humble. They have this degree of humility. That is that competence and humility merged in that leadership that ensures that, right, they can drive their agenda. And that means that they can attract people who have those qualities as well, can attract those people to form teams that lead to significant changes. Now, coming back to your question, when you look at some of these, discordant relationship between, at times, the policymaker and then the policy research institutes, there is a notion that we know it all, right? At times there is this lack of humility to say, okay, what is the best? We did a study regarding what BEAC should do during COVID. What are the monetary policy options that BEAC, our central bank, should undertake as far as ways of mitigating the economic issues that came from COVID, right? As a policymaker and as an administrator, you do not have the time to do research. You don't. And if you do, then you're not a good administrator. And if you're a good administrator, you don't have time to do research. So there is an inherent complementarity that has to be appreciated. That while you are a good administrator, you need good research and evidence to do that. But there is usually that lack of humility. There is also the times when, I'll tell you this, that policymakers at times they have a particular idea and they want research that confirms that idea. So they are not willing to accept that, well,
something which is opposite
with what they presupposed. That is a major, discrepancy that we face, because you may want to ensure that there is women empowerment. And as I've said many times, you may want to ensure that there is women empowerment. But how do you ensure that there is women empowerment when you have our women are requiring to open bank accounts, they have more documents that are expected of them versus men? So you can't tell me that you want that. Now I understand and I respect that you want to empower women. But I would say, rather than saying you want to empower women, remove the barriers that's in front of everybody. Don't just choose to say you want to empower women. Yes, women have they go through a lot. But just go about removing all the barriers.
And everybody becomes
will be empowered
at the same level.
At the same level, right? So there are times when there is this discrepancy regarding what are the policy ideas that a particular government wants to undertake. Whether it's subsidies, whether it's incentive, they have ideas of it, but they are not willing to put it to test for us to see, for them to see whether that is actually the best course of action. I'll tell you that there are many policies that have been implemented by development partners that have just flat out failed. And they failed because they never really had Cameroonians on the driving seat, or even when Cameroonians were on the driving seat, they were just there to sign. So that got to change. And those are some of the issues there. But our governments need to, appreciate the fact that you have Cameroonians who are well endowed, well educated, know the policy options, know the international community very well, know the local or the in-country realities very well, and are willing to ensure that good policies are put in place that everybody, most people, the vast majority of folks are going to understand and appreciate as positive impacts in their lives. So that's the issue you have between governments and policy institutes.
Now, we live at a time when public opinion and perception is shaped by partisans and advocacy organizations. Do you think this is having a negative perception of think tanks in countries like Cameroon and maybe Africa?
I think it is, but I am not worried about that. I am not worried about that because while there is populism, right? There is people saying, okay, this is what is a la mode. This is what's in fashion, so to speak. There is nothing, there is no country in the world, if you find one, there is no country in the world that has developed from a populist agenda. Populism is good, but you have to base policies on well-founded rationale. You look at Singapore, people talk about the miracle in Singapore or in the East Asian. So they did not implement populist agenda. They implemented policies that were grounded in their countries. And that at the bottom of it, when even you look at China, China's policies are policies that are, for their country, is well-founded. Look at the US, look at European Union, you look at all of these places. So yes, there is populist agenda, there is that going on, but you cannot, people still look for where is the good analysis that's done. So for us, it is very important not to be sidetracked by partisan favor. Whenever the government does things that are good, I am the first to say, oh, this is well done, well done. When it doesn't do well, I am also the first to say it's not being done well. When a political party has a good proposal, I compliment that. When they are off the boat, I am against that, right? So you need to be able to have, and there is, especially in our country today, if you are not independent, you get tagged as either you are for the government or you are for the opposition. But we are neither for, we are
and
not
sometimes when you are independent, you're forced to make a choice.
You are forced, no, yes, but we say, no, we are for the people, right? So we don't support government just because, we like them, no. We support government based on a good government policy. We don't support the opposition because we like them, no. We support them to figure out what are they proposing to Cameroonians. Is it good or bad? If it's not good, we don't support, right? So those are, those are the issues. You see what's happened, not just, in the sub-region, but, across Africa, there is a new wave of coup d'etats. Yeah. There's a new wave of coup d'etats. And, the populist perception, I would say this, is that it's good. Now, a lot of people who say it's good have not read about the 70s and the 80s. There is no coup d'etat that's good. Let me be categorical. There is no coup d'etat that's good. Whether it's a military coup d'etat, whether it's a constitutional coup d'etat, whether it's an electoral coup d'etat, there is no coup d'etat that's good. Every coup d'etat leads to a significant disenfranchisement of populations. And it puts evidence out of the works. The way societies, develop, grow, is by a free exchange of knowledge, free debate, like we are having here. Free debate, free conversations of ideas, and for the best ideas to come out from, in Cameroon, the 27 million Cameroonians that are there, for the best ideas to come out, and for government to use the best ideas that come out to say, okay, let's not construct a road that leads to nowhere. Believe me, there are many roads in Cameroon that leads to nowhere. Let's construct roads that actually leads to, economic development for it. So those are issues, and there are things like that that make me not worried about populism and all, like the favor that's there. At the end of the day, after a year, Cameroonians and Africans will ask them one question: do I have a job? Is it a good paying job? And populism will not have provided that.
Okay, now let's go to the Central African Think Tank Forum to hold in Yaoundé. First of all, what triggered this idea?
Well, it's important because when you look at think tanks and independent research across the continent, you will not be surprised to learn that the Central Africa region has the weakest, independent research. First, we know in our zip code, in our neighborhood in Central Africa, when you look at development parameters compared to East Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa, North Africa, unfortunately, in Central Africa, we are the least developed. when you look at regional integration, unfortunately for us in Central Africa, we are the least regionally integrated. When you look at all these development markers, unfortunately of the 5 regions, we are the last. Now that's not a good position to be. It is not good to be last all the time. Part of the reasons why you have that, or you have this, is that the knowledge ecosystem is not open in most of our Central African countries. And because the knowledge ecosystem is not open, independent research is not strong.
It's not strong.
And if you don't have strong independent research, you can have strong, good policy analysis that's done. And if you don't have good policy analysis that's done, the government and the policy makers do not have the right, solutions to implement. So the Central Africa Think Tank Forum is the very first, think tank forum for Central African think tanks. It's happening in Yaoundé, and it's to bring think tanks from all over the sub-region. Now, first to assess the situations on the ground, the realities of the ground currently, the realities of their think tanks, and how strong and how good, as you asked the question earlier, how good are their think tanks? Where are their strengths and where are their weaknesses? And how can us all collaborate to ensure that we mutually reinforce each other? That when you look at issues like, trade within the sub-region, how do we, enhance trade within the sub-region, the free movement of people and goods within the Central Africa region? How do we ensure, free economic exchanges? How do we ensure that the security situations that we have in this region, that is really, really deleterious? How do we ensure that we can start looking for positive outcomes? How can we get to that point? So that's fundamentally, why we are organizing this first Central Africa Think Tank Forum, because we believe that by mutualizing effort, by understanding our collective weaknesses and areas where we can work together, it allows us to be able to put together a unified front and be able to have more impact on the policy agenda.
Tell us some of the highlights, what to expect from the forum.
Well, fundamentally, some of the issues that we want to accomplish is, to ensure that we create a network of Central Africa think tanks. A network of Central Africa think tanks that looks at major policy issues. And these issues are pretty much commonplace in all Central African countries. There are governance issues, there is jobs, economic issues, policy making. We are all part of the CEMAC region and the central, the ECAS region. As part of that ECAS region, there are commonalities regarding the job situation in our country. There are commonalities regarding how women, what we call care work. A lot of women spend most of their time doing care work that's not remunerated, care work in the house, which is good, but that's not captured in our GDP. How do we ensure that the work, a very good productive work that is done in the care economy, how do we ensure that that gets to feature in our GDP? How do we ensure that human security? When you look at the Lake Chad Basin, you look at Boko Haram, when you look at issues regarding, the Central Africa corridor, Chad, the Chad issues, how do we ensure that human security can be put at the forefront and we can start thinking of sustainable solutions? Because most of the solutions that we currently implement are band-aid solutions. But how do we ensure that when you look at, resolving security crisis or so, the communities, involved or affected are on the table, in finding the solutions to those crises. And importantly, how do we mitigate, crisis from happening in the first place? How do we ensure that we have early warning signs that when there is a problem brewing, it can be anticipated and interventions can be brought into play quicker?
Before it escalates. Before it escalates.
And how do we put in place de-escalatory measures to take into consideration what people are angry about and then figure out how we de-escalate this situation and ensure that we can build, you know, come on, the vivre ensemble. You know, we can ensure that there is good understanding among, you know, all the different stakeholders. So those are the issues that we are looking to really discuss and look for ways of finding, you know, common ground in these issues across the Central Africa region, and ensure that we can push the Central Africa region to be more open. When you are open, you develop. When you are open, you develop. Being open in what way? Being open to ideas, being open to economic transactions, being open to investments, being open to your diaspora. When you are open, you can really leverage a lot of goodwill to ensure that your population, your citizens also benefit from that, and there's that free exchange of knowledge and development follows through.
Now, moving on from the forum, how would you engage with the policy implementers, that's the government, to ensure that some of these ambitions come to light?
Well, great question. Part of the policy, the forum already has government institutions and members involved. The policymakers themselves, as you know, ensuring that there are the researchers, there are the policymakers on the front, there are media practitioners like yourself. There are, you know, it's a good stakeholder brought together to ensure that we are not speaking in isolation. No, we're not speaking in isolation, but that we ensure that policymakers understand the policy options that are available, but also that the policy process is understood by researchers, because most policy processes are not linear. There are starts and stops and things like that, and then there are different places where it gets stuck. There is the parliament, there is the executive branch, there are, you know, subnational stakeholders that are involved. So all of these people are going to be part of this discussion to ensure that there is the beginning of mutual understanding regarding what it takes to be able to ensure that a good policy proposal is not good when it stays on the shelves.
It must be implemented. It
has to be implemented. When you've designed and you've done research on a good policy and you have good policy options, it cannot rest on the shelf. Now, unfortunately, we have a lot of good policies that are resting and carrying dust on the shelf. And the person who is having to pay for that is the average citizen when those policies are not implemented, good policies not implemented. And I'll tell you also, Mr. Sosi, one of the reasons why it's very important and why we are very passionate about this work is that when a bad policy is implemented, it takes a long time before it gets changed. At times more than 20 years. From a policy that's recognized as bad to be changed. So we want to make sure that bad policies don't get implemented in the first place.
In the first place, yeah.
Because taking those bad policies off the book is a difficult situation, to say the very least. Because there are times when folks do not have the political currency to spend. They say, oh no, I'm not going to go touch that because it will lose me political capital. But they know that it's a bad policy. I'll give you an example. There is nobody who tells you that subsidies are good.
They're good. Sure.
But how many politicians are you going to find who are going to spend their political capital to remove subsidies? There are very few. I mean, there are very few. But so it's important for you for a country and policy making to not start a particular policy. Let's say we want to do the one on universal health coverage. That policy needs to be started in a very good way. Because if you make mistakes at the very beginning, those mistakes are going to be costly. Not just costly in financial terms, but at times they're costly in lives. In people dying from bad policies. So we don't want that. And it takes a long time before it gets worked off the books. So those are the reasons why things like this are very important, because if we do it badly, right, it comes back to haunt us. We see this all the time. Policies that we implemented in the country 30 years ago, today are haunting us in the country. So it's very important for us to implement good policies from the very get-go.
Now, the Nkafu Policy Institute has been one of those think tanks in Cameroon that has been engaging with government on producing several policies for the government. How would you rate that collaboration with the government?
I think the collaboration is, I would say, is good. It's mutually respectful, but it's not enough. It's not enough in the sense that there is still a lot of reticence or reluctance to accept certain policy proposals, especially ones that do not align with current government agenda or policy viewpoint. One of the policy proposals that we've been pushing lately is an issue we're calling a Startup Act. I've talked about this before, a Startup Act, where we want Parliament to pass an act of Parliament that would ensure that startups in the country have the breathing room to actually explore and grow and have the opportunity to really
make turnover before,
good turnover before they start paying taxes or lots of taxes to government, where they can have 5-year tax-free remuneration. The whole process of accessing capital is much less. You can create economic zones that ensures that startups can have the opportunity to grow, to create decent jobs, and then to bring employment and create wealth. So that is an area where conversations are being had in the Ministry of Small Enterprises or so on some of those potential policy areas. So there are collaborations there. There's collaboration on the health front, on digital health and issues on the health front. There are the issues regarding insurance that we talk about, that we've done good work on. There is even the issue where we talk about, and I've mentioned this in other forums, where we have problems where when you go to the hospital, a lot of our healthcare providers are receiving a lot of threats from patients. Mm-hmm. Now, whether it's because of bad outcomes or otherwise, but it's an area where policy making is important for it, and those are the areas that we are working with government. But the collaboration needs to be deeper. Okay,
now what's left for the year 2023? We are in September, and so many activities have been carried out. How will the Nkafu Policy Institute close the year?
Well, part of it is ensuring that, again, we are very focused on policy proposals for policy adoption. We are very focused on a big part of our work is SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, and how we train those SMEs to be stronger, and the policies that go with ensuring that we have a strong SME sector in the country. So continuing the work in our health, health proposal side, but also the areas where we really work on governance issues. So there is a lot of work in that arena. We also want to make sure that the media is aware of a lot of this work. So there is this engagement through your viewers to be able to understand some of the key issues that are ongoing in the country and where to become involved. So there is a lot of engagements that in the course of the remaining months for the year to better engage with the media to ensure that some of these results that have been that we've gotten, some of these policy proposals are brought to the forefront for all stakeholders to appreciate and go from there. Because foundation, the main issues here is how do we ensure that the country goes forward, a lot of the problems get solved, a lot of the crises that we can have very sensible, common sense solutions to them and move forward. So those are the things that we are engaging in for the rest of the year.
Doctor, think tanks need a lot of resources. When I mean resources, I would like to mention finance to carry out the research for necessary policies to be put in place. And funding remains a major problem. How can think tanks scale through this problem to become more efficient?
Every think tank that you ask, whether it's in Central Africa or other parts of Africa, funding is at times the #1 challenge that they face. The lack of independent funding is at times the #1 challenge that they face. Now, part of it is also part of the issues that you talked about earlier, the relationship between governments and think tanks. In research and development, most countries that have developed, they have invested a lot on research and development. Our research and development budget in the country is not up to 2%, right? Now, there is some research that's going on through universities structures or so, but the overall funding packet is still very minimal. So government allocation to research is still very small. Now, you have other development partners that are interested in research questions and other forms of independent research. You see that a lot of think tanks have been able to get funding either from private funders or from development partners and independent research. Now, there's always, or independent funders. There's always the question, okay, the governments are not funding. Some funding partners internationally are providing resources. Now, you may be doing, the bidding for them, right?
Exactly. I was just about asking because there's always that fear that he who pays the piper could dictate the tune.
Yes.
Is that the same for think tanks?
Well, I tell everybody on our team that first, the one thing about Nkafu and our team is that we pride ourselves and we focus a lot on independent research. Independent research. What we believe fundamentally is that societies have to be free. Societies have to be free. So we do not undertake any research or receive any funding from anybody to come tell us how our research is going to be done. Or what our research, findings have to be. So if you are interested in a particular outcome, then it is not us. But obviously there are some think tanks, unfortunately, or some research institutions where because of the need for funding, they go after things like that. It is not the right way to do. The way it should happen is the way it happens in other advanced economies. Even you look at South Africa, there is a research council in South Africa that has good funding, and it provides evidence-based funding to researchers who do independent research. We don't have to look at the US, we don't have to look at the EU, we don't have to look at the UK, we don't have to look at France. Look at what happens in Ghana, some of the research funding mechanisms there in Ghana, and do something similar. The issue that we have to face in our country is that government does not need to control everything. Government does not need to control everything. And if government wants to control everything, then most of the time, they just, for lack of a better word, they mess it up. Because you can't have independent research when you are dictating the outcome for it. And so those are the issues that think tanks in Central Africa face primarily. Funding is a big one. The other one is that there is also the lack of quality researchers. Quality researchers, where folks are well-grounded in the research methodology. So you will find that just like what we do at Nkafu, we train researchers for a very long time, right? They go through all kinds of training in various research methods. To build up those skills, because most of the times those skills are not found in our university sector. As far as I know, there is no university in the country that is really teaching policy analysis in the country. Policy analysis. How do you go through the policy process? I may be wrong, but most of the folks, our researchers who are Cameroonian trained, and say, well, a lot of this policy analysis, so think tanks, so many people are not really aware of it. But it's because of the fact that over our independent, post-independent period, the relationship between government and think tanks has been very not smooth.
Not smooth.
And so the sector hasn't really grown a lot. You have a lot more contract research being done. And you will not be surprised when I tell you that there are many embassies around and development partners who contract with Cameroonian researchers to provide research. They take that and they go and they present it to the Cameroonian government. And then the Cameroonian government says, okay, this is very good.
And it's coming from there.
It's coming from here, right? So we want to like take that we want to break that barrier, for it, because the view needs to be first that we are looking to figure out what are the best options for us as a country, what are the scenarios that Cameroon faces in the economic landscape, in job creation, in governance, what are the major challenges or so, and how do we overcome those? If you don't have a very robust, very robust, in-depth analysis of the issues, you go with political slogans that really doesn't take us far. And that's what we want to mitigate.
Now, you just spoke about the absence of quality researchers. Could brain drain be a major factor to this as well?
Yes, it could be. I don't want to minimize the impact of that it could be. But I would say more so that brain drain is not necessarily the driver of it. The driver of it is what comes out of our university training and the in-depth of the university training. Now, we have many university professors who talk about the level of, there are many university professors who talk about the reduction, the drop in the standards. At our universities. I'm not the one saying it. They're saying they are the ones teaching in the universities, and they're the ones who say it, that the standards have dropped. Now, if the standards have dropped, by extrapolation, you realize that what folks come out, the level of understanding and analysis that they come out with, with their degree, they require extra training in order for the analysis to be more in depth. Yeah. So that's what I would say is the main driver, not necessarily brain drain. Okay.
One last question before we go. If there's a call you need to make to the government and maybe the media, because the media is also a stakeholder, what could that be?
Well, I would say this. I would say the media plays a very vital role in the life of any country. In the life of any society, communication is critical. So the first thing that I would say is that for media, it's very important to have, to go beyond slogans. Right? Like what we're having here is go beyond slogans, go in depth. So we're talking in the program in depth, right? Go in depth. It's very important to go in depth. Go in depth to look at, what are the real issues? As they say, root cause, right? What are the root causes of where we find ourselves? I always use the medical example. When we have a complication, if I perform surgery and there is a complication, you have to figure out what is the root cause of that complication, not necessarily what is superficial.
Yeah.
The root cause may have been that the patient came late to the hospital. And why did they come late to the hospital? Because in order to travel the distance that they took, by the time they got to the hospital, it was already late. And that would be the root cause. So you have to go beyond the superficial and have a more detailed conversation, in-depth conversation regarding what are the drivers of the issues that we face. Yeah. If we are having problems in, education, what are the drivers? If teachers are protesting, salaries, you should not just solve the salary issue. Go to the root cause of that and try to like deal with that. So the thing about the media that I would say is that continue to dive deeper to understand and communicate, you know, some of the root causes of why we have the issues that we have. I think that is a quintessential role that the media plays, should play, and should continue to play. Now, the thing that I would say to policymakers is that nous sommes tous Camerounais, you know, so we are all Cameroonians and we all want the betterment of Cameroon. We all want the society, the country as Cameroon to get better. We all want each and every one of our citizens to get better. And so we have to collaborate to find, you know, solutions to problems rather than be seen as adversarials. And most of the time, the person who is in government is the one that has to have a good deal of humility. Yeah. And I would say our partners in government, in all government structure, please, a little bit of humility and acceptance that you don't know it all. Nobody knows it all. So to claim otherwise is very short-sighted. So that is what I would say, a little dose of humility and then a focus on let's really put our heads together to figure out how together we can find durable solutions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Denis Foretia, the founder and chief executive officer of the Nkafu Policy Institute. It's a pleasure to have interviewed you. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Peter. It's always great to be with you. Thanks to all the collaborators at Dash Media.
And to you, televiewers, it was a pleasure being with you on this edition of the program. Until next time, it's bye-bye.